is being completed, which is entitled Resistance to the French Occupation of West Africa. Mr. Griffeth technically joined the UCLA faculty in July of 1963. However, he spent his first year in research on pre-colonial history in West Africa, including collecting and translating West African manuscripts which were written in Arabic. His teaching duties include a course on the survey of West African history and a seminar in pre-colonial West African history. He's obviously very well qualified to speak on his subject, which is the African past, using Africa's history to argue for its future. It is a pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Griffeth.
A distinguished African historian who is now the chancellor of a major West African university spoke in the pre-independence year of 1953 concerning the links between the study of African history and culture and the prospects then being raised for colonial self-government. This historian, Professor Kenneth O. Dike of Nigeria, said then that concern for and understanding of the African past lay at the root of the question of self-government. If the African has no past heritage, he contended, and no future except by imitation of the European ways at a pace which the European thinks safe, then Africa is destined to fail in bringing about stable new governments and cohesive societies. But if the instinctive belief of Africans in his own traditions is justified, then ultimate emergence of African states as independent modern nations cannot be doubted. Every nation, Professor Dike concluded, builds its future on its past. So the African must not only instinctively have faith in his own inheritance, but must also satisfy himself by scientific inquiry that it exists. There was hardly an observer of the African scene in that year of 1953, either among Africans or among outsiders interested in Africa, who would have predicted that within a decade, not only colonial self-government would come to be, but that thoroughgoing political independence would come to all states in Africa north of the Zambezi River. Professor Dike's somewhat abstract plea thus arrived clothed as a problem demanding solution. How were Africans to speak for themselves and of their past when they were suddenly projected as new nations into a globally oriented world? The curtain had gone up on the drama of African state building. But what was there to be gained from reflecting upon the long rehearsal in the years before the 1960s? I feel that two major themes can be distinguished. In the first place, Africans, like all other peoples who live together in large or small social groups, possess self-images, and these images extend back over time. Furthermore, the collective consciousness of the past has become a rapidly expanding awareness of crucial connections which go far beyond the immediate confines of any given local social group. This process of thinking about oneself as a part of the much larger African and world communities has not come only as the result of recently granted political independence. In fact, most African societies have always possessed ways and means of expressing to themselves and to others their ideas regarding such matters as social change and relations with their neighbors. And it is primarily through these ill-defined but nonetheless very real means that Africans have perceived their achievements and their place in the world about them. Among these perceptions is that feature which has been called the Oriental mirage, the romantic, idealized conception of a golden age of past glory. Africans, no less than other peoples, are given to mutual backslapping, and elements of this idealized notion of history have found convenient niches in current all-embracing nationalist mythologies. But this should not obscure the central point, which is that Africans do have a sense of history. And it is this sense of history, carefully assessed alongside a slowly accumulating data, which historians are given to calling their evidence, documents, archaeological remains, and the like, with which the modern writer on African history must deal. This then provides the second main theme of the recovery and the uses of the past, written history. That is, history written down, interpreted, as contrasted to history which is merely the collective memory of a people. Scholarly attempts to pierce the veil which always shrouds and obscures the view of events and processes seen in long time perspective have been, with reference to Africa, further confused by a frightening misunderstanding on the part of non-Africans. A recent demonstration of this misunderstanding may be illustrated by quoting a very eminent historian of modern Europe on the subject of African history. British undergraduates, declared this historian on a widely publicized BBC broadcast, are being seduced, as always, by the changing breath of journalistic fashion. They demand that they should be taught African history. This, he indicates, is impossibly wrong-headed of them. Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at the present there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. To claim that African history is some curious entity discovered by outsiders is, to say the least, mildly bumptious. To claim that Europeans have in fact invented the whole subject borders on the most superlative form of cultural arrogance. What I shall attempt to suggest here tonight is that history may be viewed from two perspectives. One, a willingness to penetrate and to understand the collective consciousness of any people about their own past. Two, coupled to this understanding should be the systematic evaluation of that consciousness using all the available resources which the investigator can command. The coalescence of these two perspectives is what gives African history its formal shape. A famous book published some years back that spoofed the English and their institutions defined history as that which you can remember. This particular book makes the point that the history one remembers is a curious residue of isolated fact, such as the names of kings with funny-sounding titles, and a series of general and fuzzy ideas about historical processes. And while this spoof no doubt contains a grain of truth and strikes a responsive chord in us, there are other memories which we all have that form part of our own historical consciousness, such as what our parents told us about Aunt Maud, whom we may never have seen personally, or how McKinley was the only American president who knew anything about the tariff question, interpretation, such things as these. And from these assorted bits and pieces, we each make up a fabric of understanding from which we deduce things about our society and how it came to be as it is. Similarly, the African has ways and means of weaving a fabric from which he may draw the picture of his society. And I would like to suggest to you a few important components which go into making up this consciousness. In most African societies, the extended family, that is, mom, dad, grandmother, grandfather, and all the relatives, not just the ones who weren't horse thieves, this constitutes the basic social unit. Relations with one's neighbors are similarly defined in terms of one's extended family relationship to other extended families. The simplest way of defining this relationship is for all people to point to a common ancestor who lived sometime in the distant past and who was the great father of everyone. It is in this way that many of the peoples of southwestern Nigeria, the Yoruba peoples, see themselves as members of a larger collectivity, as the children of Odudwa, the founder of the sacred city of Ile-Ife, home of all the Yoruba. In reference to the founding fathers, of course, is not an uncommon characteristic. We hear it every day, especially these days. So this process of tracing and common agreement does indeed form an important element of historical memory, especially in African society. For here, family interconnections form a part of the very social cement. Furthermore, constant reference to them in day-to-day living enhances their importance as valuable clues to the social historian who seeks to understand what people mean when they refer to themselves and when they cite cases from their own past. Another element of the collective historical memory that is also related to the broadly conceived family is that of land ownership. A chief, back some years now, who was answering questions put to him by an official committee of a colonial power that was set up to regularize legal definitions of land ownership, this chief stated that, "I conceive that land belongs to a vast family, of which many are dead, few are living, and countless members are yet to be born." This remarkably terse statement indicates a very well-defined historical overview, and one which is present in a great number of African societies. That is, society is seen as itself a great family in which one includes not only those who are physically present, but those who have gone before and will come after. It derives its authority and a sense of continuity by this sort of inclusiveness. Now, such a view has undoubted religious overtones, but this does not necessarily mean that it should be eliminated from consideration as an important historical overview. The history of family ties, which are seen extending back through past generations and projecting into the future, have also been incorporated into the written sources, just as we find them in oral tradition. These sources are the histories written by those who possessed knowledge of the Arabic language. Much of what these Africans who wrote Arabic put down formed genealogies of kings, of leading scholarly clans, of other important personages within the Islamic community. They form as a body, and when taken alongside other chronologies of important events and battles, so forth, these form the framework of a dated historical narrative that goes, I might add, well beyond in time the arrival of the European. They have continued these written histories of Africa that are pre-European. They have continued to make their contribution to the African self-image, the image of himself. In societies which did not possess writing, there were frequently selected members of the family group, especially among kingly families, who had as their most important duty the obligation to commit to memory long and detailed lists of important men and important events. Anthropologists have called these individuals professional remembrancers, and, as any anthropologist may tell you, their feats of accurate recall are truly prodigious. Some detailed records have been preserved over many generations, often in a form no less accurate than if they were written, although they were the exclusive product of trained minds. These, too, serve the function of providing a narrative and development of African achievement. It seems fair to say, therefore, that the modern observer may discover within African society a very real and a very much alive tradition of historical thinking, which is not based merely upon the reminiscences of old men, but is intricately linked with people's conscious image of themselves. A tradition in which steps have been taken to accurately preserve the memories upon which that image is based, and that this is bound up in the very way in which society in Africa is most commonly put together, by delineating family links both in the contemporary scene and over time. Impinging on this image and altering it somewhat, ultimately coming to form a part of it, has been the long experience of African contact with non-Africans. Some historians have taken the absence of writing in large areas of Africa to mean that historical consciousness could not have commenced until this very vital means of preserving it appeared. I again refer to the earlier quotation of the distinguished historian who said that there was no African history until the Europeans arrived. The immediate error of this point of view is that it has no basis in fact. Africa's contact with the outside world should not be measured from the arrival of Portuguese mariners on its western shores in the 15th century, the usual date given, but from the very historical record itself, way back to the Islamic expansion of the 8th century AD. Dating from this time, there are written records, some of the type which I have described. In many cases, these are detailed written records about societies, states, and empires in the vast Sudanic belt that stretches from east to west across Africa, south of the Sahara, and north of the forest zone. From the 10th through the 18th century, these Arabic writings show that there were indeed large-scale states in which Islamic traditions of scholarship, not merely the writing of chronologies, but of scholarship, were alive and flourishing. The memories of them have not been dimmed in succeeding years. In fact, they have been revived from time to time. Although many of the writings which we possess today were composed by visitors, that is, non-sub-Saharan Africans, a significant body of other material originated within the Sudan itself, and this has been jealously guarded. These documents constitute yet another facet of Africa's history as seen by Africans, a veritable testament to the existence of an internal historical tradition. The technique of writing, to be sure, came from the outside, but this should not be taken to confound writing with historical consciousness. However, there have been more recent influences from outside Africa that have contributed mightily to the growth of an historically viewed African nationalism. And it is to 3 or 4 of these lines of influence that I would now like to turn. Perhaps the most important among the imported ideas and institutions have been those associated with religious belief and the church as an organized social institution itself. Christianity and Christian missions made their appearance in Northeast Africa during the first years of Christianity's spread from its homeland in the Fertile Crescent. Indeed, North Africa preserved a Christian tradition in a non-Roman form by and large until the Islamic invasions of the 7th and 8th centuries. In the upper Nile Valley and in Ethiopia, the Coptic Christian church remains to this day a by no means ephemeral institution. Christianity in its European dress made its greatest first impression on Africa south of the Sahara in what is now the area around the mouth of the Congo River. The Portuguese who arrived there in the 15th century found a large, centrally organized state called the Kingdom of the Congo. Within a few years of this initial contact between Congo and Portugal, Congo's King Alfonso became a convert to the new religion, dispatched his sons to Portugal to be educated, and requested that missionaries and craftsmen be sent to teach in his state. From the point of view of African-European relations, this beginning noble experiment turned out to be a colossal failure, as the early Christian missionary impulse soon gave way to slave trading, and the Christian kings of the Congo found themselves confronted by both internal and external enemies who sought to reap the rewards of this new trade. But in the 19th century, Christian missionary activity was revived. Particularly in southern Africa, European-controlled mission stations soon gave rise to a movement which became directly involved in early nationalist activity. This has been called the separatist church movement. The separatist churches were formed when Africans educated at the mission stations rebelled against the conservative controls imposed upon them as supposedly equal brothers in Christ, and built up their own church organization under their own African control. In the process of creating these new churches, much of the European cultural content of Christianity was rejected, and traditional concepts and practices introduced in its place. There thus came into being an African church whose first steps had been to seek independence from outside control. The ideas which inspired it had been placed in a context understandable to its members. And the relationship of this decision to go it on one's own to modern nationalism is fairly obvious. Separatism made articulate in one crucial area, social life, the possibilities for innovation in other areas, including political life. A further point should be emphasized with respect to the African character of the separatist movement. One of its forms came to be called Ethiopianism, whereby the connections to Africa's first and oldest form of Christianity were made explicit. Missions and reaction to missionary activity were, of course, not the only ways which Africans made contact with the outside world, assimilated its ideas, and transformed them to accord with the African historical consciousness. Another important avenue by which new ideas traveled back to Africa was through the agency of Africans who sojourned abroad, usually in the pursuit of education. But the foreign student is not an exclusive product of the last 20 or 30 years. In the first place, Muslim Africans had been accustomed to making the Hajj, or pilgrimage, to Mecca for over 1,000 years. Many of these pilgrims stayed on in Cairo or other great centers of Islamic learning to receive Quranic training before returning to their homelands. When they did return, they frequently brought with them new ideas, which then sifted down into African society. I mentioned earlier that the King of Congo had sent his children to Portugal to be educated. This was in the early part of the 16th century. And from that date forward, there were numerous other examples of Africans who had either gone voluntarily or who had been sent to school or perhaps on official missions to European capitals. These too returned with new ideas, which then found their way into the African view of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, there aren't many records of these visits which survive today, and we know little about the results produced when new ideas were brought back by these foreign visitors until the 19th century. At this relatively late period, however, there does exist a substantial body of information about those Africans who had been abroad, who had returned home, and the impact which these men, with their new outlooks, had upon African society. There were those freed men who returned to either Sierra Leone or to Liberia. Many of these became traders who ranged widely over West Africa, and the history of their settlement and of their influence in numerous communities is a fascinating subject to which much current research is being devoted. Among them also were men who wrote with great eloquence on topics involving the treatment of Africans. And among them were men who foresaw at a very early stage the eventual demise of colonial rule in the face of Africa's growth to meet outside challenge. One such man was Dr. Edward Blyden. Born in the West Indies in 1833, arrived in Liberia around 1850, he wrote extensively on numerous subjects concerning Africa. Blyden perhaps touched upon the very heart of the problem of historical consciousness when he stated in 1883 that no people can interpret Africans but the Africans themselves. As an outsider, Blyden may well be taken to have meant no people can interpret Africans without showing cognizance that the Africans do in fact interpret themselves. It is the bringing to the fore in an articulate form this African self-interpretation that Blyden felt and historians today feel is so terribly important. Other ideas which influenced the growth of a nationalist feeling arrived in Africa as the result of contacts established with the Afro-American community. From the first days of American Negro missionary activity in southern Africa, right up through the time only a few years back now, when Thurgood Marshall acted as counsel to the Kenya delegation at the Kenya Independence Conference, that there has developed a growing awareness in Africa that colonialism, in its political form, was not altogether unrelated to more subtle forms of racial oppression that existed elsewhere in the world. Certain American Negro leaders of the early 20th century sought to make the point explicit by directly tying the colonial condition of Africa to the general condition of Negroes the world over. The most important of these figures were Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Carter Woodson. The echoes of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, which hit its peak of organizational achievement in the United States during the early 1920s, may be found today in Africa through such statements as that by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, when he remarked that the most important experience he had as a student in the United States, mainly at Lincoln University, his most important memory was the reading of Marcus Garvey's Philosophy and Opinions, the book I most normally associated with Garvey's writing. Similarly, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Harvard-educated scholar who turned his enormous talents to promoting organizations that emphasized worldwide Negro solidarity, these left their impression on the subsequent evolution of Pan-African thinking. Again, ideas by Americans imported into Africa because of concern with the general condition of those of African descent. Carter Woodson, another American, was perhaps the first historian anywhere to tackle head-on the problem of writing African history as the history of African society. This in his pioneering work, The African Background Outlined. Here again, it must be emphasized that the ideas of these and other men are still in the category of influences. That they are important influences goes without saying, but they do in fact stand outside this mainstream of the African self-image, himself and his society. More than anything else, these outside ideas which have had an impact on Africa have stimulated the desire by Africans to raise to the surface their own historical heritage, and this, they feel, is the best way to ensure not only internal solidarity, but to confront the subtle hostilities and condescending attitudes of the rest of the world. The growth of an African press in the late 19th century provided the foremost vehicle through which this revised self-image could be expressed. Particularly in West Africa, the newspaper became a means of disseminating ideas, and it opened a forum in which African topics could be discussed. It also provided one of the few places where treatments of African historical topics could find their way into print. The first regular journal, owned by Africans in the former Gold Coast Territory, now Ghana, appeared in March of 1874, some years before the actual establishment of colonial administrations. Similar dates, some earlier, could be given for the beginnings of West African newspapers in other territories. The press remained right down through the period of independence as the surest means of gaining an audience, and often, if the editor became too outspoken, the best means of landing in prison. At the present time, the African press would seem to have lost some of its earlier vitality, the vitality it had during the pre-independence period, but as an essential and as an historically significant participant in the growth and modeling of African nationalist ideas, its role cannot be overemphasized. An amalgam of ideas has thus merged into a truly African stream of thought, and this in turn casts its reflection on the modern scene. For instance, the recognition by Africans living outside that savanna belt I spoke of earlier, where the old empires of the 10th through the 16th century were located, have fixed upon the existence of these empires as sufficient basis to speak of an age of African glory. That is to say, some writers, reacting to the image of an Africa utterly without moments of greatness in the past, have laid forward equally extravagant claims to counterbalance the earlier derogatory image. While such activities can be well understood in the context of human aspirations and hopes, no particular emphasis is needed to suggest that they depart often very radically from what has long been known about these empires. The African glory theme is in fact a fairly new phenomenon, related more to political ideology than to history. It should be further emphasized that myth-building of this sort knows close cousins in nearly all other of the world's nations. But merely because it is being done in Africa should not, as it has to some, serve as evidence that the Africans must invent their history in order to have any at all. There is, however, one area in which propensities to engage in myth-weaving take real and well-documented historical events and personalities as their focus. A major theme of past writers has been that the colonial occupation of Africa was easily accomplished by European powers with a minimum of resistance on the part of African states. Even where there were well-organized states, such writers have said, they collapsed almost immediately before the overwhelming superiority of small numbers of well-armed European soldiers. Now, two important considerations have been obscured by this general view. First, examples of effective African resistance have been overlooked by and large. And secondly, the effects which resistance had on the African consciousness of himself have thus been relegated to such categories as are expressed in the terms like the native problem. In order to obtain a clear view of that which was African society that so apparently crumbled before the European superiority, in order to have a view of that society, a long second look is indeed pertinent. I should like to take a moment to examine this problem by citing an important example of African resistance with an eye toward illuminating some of the facets which appear from this examination in contemporary writing on African history. My example concerns a military leader and religious chief who lived in an area that I will call Southern Mende. Southern Mende includes portions of a number of West African nations, modern nations such as the Ivory Coast and Mali and Upper Volta, Guinea. This particular chief to whom I am referring was named Samori Touré, one of the distinguished predecessors of the current president of the Republic of Guinea. And he began his career as a lieutenant in the service of an African king who ruled over a small city-state in southern Mende. Samori's military prowess and organizational abilities showed him to be a leader who could draw upon sufficient popular support to overthrow his former master. Following this coup, he set about systematically enlarging the boundaries of his small city-state, and by the year 1870 he became the most powerful ruler in all the interior of Mendeland. His army was composed of faithful adherents and slaves, all of whom possessed a degree of Muslim enthusiasm. His wealth was derived from regular and proper Islamic taxation upon the agricultural lands of his domain, and further, he derived wealth from dealings in slaves, mainly those Africans who resisted conversion to Islam. By the late 1870s, units of Samori's armies were ranging very far indeed from their homeland, hundreds of miles up into the region of the upper Senegal River. Here they met with a new opponent, the French, who at this time were expanding their own empire from the west up the Senegal River. A period of 10 years followed in which there were certain abrasive conflicts, but also diplomatic correspondence between the French and Samori. And vague spheres of influence were set apart. The Samori agreeing to stay below such and such a boundary, the French agreeing not to impinge upon his territories. Around 1890, however, it became clear that a great conflict of interest was shaping up between the two. Samari, in fact, and his state blocked the route of French expansion to the south and to the east, and his penchant for raiding across the boundaries which the French had set was creating a mighty commotion among their newly protected peoples. The Governor General at Dakar and the French ministries in Paris both decided to concentrate their attention upon removing this thorn from their side. Beginning in 1889, no less than 8 major armed columns, the French called them columns, often they were full regiments of soldiers numbering as many as 3,500, equipped with modern repeating rifles and cannon. No less than 8 of these columns were dispatched to wipe out the last traces of Samari. But it took 7 years of hard campaigning to run him to ground. The results of this campaign for Samari, and consequently for the shape of this segment of African history, are worth examining. First, as Samari found himself being pursued by the French, he was forced to adopt tactics which won him a fierce and a terrible reputation within Africa. Where villages were reluctant to engage on his side, he burned them and enslaved their inhabitants, killing those who showed the slightest further recalcitrance to his cause. A residue of ill feeling still persists in the living memory of those descendants who were adversely affected by these later of his campaigns. Secondly, in the face of superior arms, Samari became a highly skilled military innovator who perceived the basic weakness of the French in their attack upon him, that being the extreme distance over which they had to move from their own bases. He adapted his military tactics accordingly and fought an effective guerrilla resistance. But we must remember here that this was, in fact, a well-organized state which was now put in a position of having to flee with a fairly large population, and that its original wealth depended upon its ability to cultivate the land. To have been able to change the whole character of this state sufficiently to meet these new circumstances and carry on a lengthy and an effective resistance was a remarkable achievement. All right, to one group of modern African writers then, Samari has been called the sanglant, the bloody or the Napoleon of the Western Sudan, for the excesses which he engaged in the latter stages of his resistance. To another group, however, Samari has emerged as the proto-nationalist, fighting for a purely African cause against the imperialist adversary. And it is at this point where historical documentation and nationalist myth-building tend to merge. What it illuminates for us, I feel, is that the old, simple explanations which treated African states as houses of cards that could easily be blown down by the first great wind of change, these ideas are no longer accurate. We must take into account the nature of African society itself. Now, needless to say, there will be many further examples of African resistance, which will inflate to much larger than life size, and this probably in the very near future. But here again, I would caution that we should not summarily dismiss the claims which will be made, because, as in the case of Samari, there's much more than a grain of truth to be gained from considering him in a new light. Now, at this point, I would like to turn back to the statement by Professor Dike, which was quoted in the introduction of my remarks. His statement that the African has a great desire to learn about his past from the carefully evaluated results of scientific inquiry. A past that will not only illuminate other parts of a vast Africa to his satisfaction, but will also stand as sufficient evidence to convince those who would argue that Africa has no tradition worth speaking of. What I am referring to, of course, is the constantly growing body of contemporary writing by scholars and dedicated amateurs, African and non-African, on African history. Such knowledge, as I suggested earlier, forms the rigorous complement to the existing consciousness of history which Africans have always possessed. A bit of background would seem relevant at this point. The notions which non-Africans have had about Africa forms a constant theme in any talk about the continent. My two distinguished predecessors on this platform made mention of it. The question is, where did the notion come from that Africans had nowhere to go but up in the pursuit of becoming whole, civilized human beings? Why has the adjective darkest commonly been applied to Africa? Why, in sum, haven't we of the West been charitable enough to apply that unfortunate adjective to our knowledge of Africa rather than to Africa itself? An American professor of African history has recently addressed himself to this question in an important full-length study entitled The Image of Africa. In this book, Professor Philip Curtin has stated that the pattern of empirical information about Africa was itself a product of the peculiar relations built up during the centuries of the slave trade. A great deal was known about the coast in ways that were intimate, detailed, and highly specialized. Almost nothing was known through direct contact with the far interior, but then very little was known about the interior of North or South America or Central Asia. The image of darkest Africa, either as an expression of geographical ignorance or one of cultural arrogance, was a 19th century innovation. Relative to their knowledge of the world in general, concludes Professor Curtin, 18th century Europeans knew more and cared more about Africa than they did at any later period up to the 1950s. Professor Curtin goes on from this point to demonstrate how the prevailing European zeitgeist, with its strong element of stated or implied racism, molded an outlook that, even for the kind-hearted, treated Africa as a relic of pre-civilized society. When such an outlook was carried along by the actual agents of European colonization, these latter tended to see everything about them and everything that they saw in Africa in terms of problems calling for solution, a factor which hampered more objective considerations of the nature of African society. The 20th century persistence of this notion, which was based on one aspect of the cultural contact between Africans and non-Africans, is much harder to explain. That is, why do these attitudes persist until today? I think it suffices to say that most people are finding it a very happy experience to discover that their past views on the subject have been excessive. Coming to that aspect of the notion which held that Africa's darkness resulted from a lack of contact, that is, geographical ignorance, some explanations are beginning to emerge. The inaccessibility of Africa, created by its forbidding shoreline and heavy rolling surf, is assuredly one important consideration which kept visitors waiting at the periphery of the continent. Another factor would certainly be the presence of the various and malevolent tropical diseases, such as malaria and yellow fever, which made any visit perilous before the introduction of modern hygienic methods to control them. But it is similarly clear that certain features of the European-African contact itself militated against any extensive traveling to interior parts. In the first place, until the latter third of the 19th century, that contact rested upon commercial bases. In the earliest time, this was trade goods. Later, slave trade, followed in the 19th century again by trade in European manufactured goods for tropical produce. And that it was this particular trading network which in fact determined the kinds of information that Europeans would take away from Africa. In the process of the growth of this commercial exchange, certain of the coastal areas of West Africa, certain of the states there, came to fulfill the role of middlemen in the trade, exchanging the products of a not so remote interior for whatever the Europeans had to offer in return. Their profit was not realized by production of any trade articles, but through their activities as entrepreneurs. These middlemen states naturally sought to bar any disruption of this profitable trade to them through direct contact of the European traders with those who were the producers of the interior. I might add as a footnote that some of the most important recent books on African history have dealt with these types of middlemen states, since there is an abundance of documentation that exists in order to write these histories. Another important factor which operated to keep hidden from the eyes of visitors the existence of large states in the interior was the presence of what has been called a middle belt, or the middle belt. The middle belt in West Africa is specifically a region in which the social units and the political units tend to be small, roughly down to the village level, and it is from this region that the larger neighboring states took most of the slaves that formed part of the transatlantic slave trade. The conditions of anarchy that prevailed made passage through this belt forbidding and difficult, whether the traveler was a European or an African. In East Africa, the forbidding landscape itself that was ranged between the coastal belt and the lakes region acted as a middle belt similar to that in the West, but here for geographical reasons. When the age of European exploration did produce new additions to geographical knowledge of Africa, such information had the tendency to become sensationalized. Reading through the accounts of exploration, one can clearly see that the moments of greatest emotion were felt by the visitor when he finally set eyes upon the eastward flowing Niger or was able to bathe in the cool, fresh waters issuing forth from Lake Tanya, the true source of the Nile. The human features of the landscape were treated as either friendly and helpful or as hostile and stupid, and as decorations along the route to the great goal which was to be seen. Other explorers, bent upon extending the anti-slavery crusade, saw mainly the effects of this terrible enterprise, the slave trade itself, on African society, and this increased the sensationalist image. While many of the earlier explorers were also very good observers, the better luck for the contemporary historian, their observations on African society have been overlooked for the most part, until quite recently. The net result of these and other factors was to produce an image of Africa that corresponded to only a small part of reality. And it was this partial understanding that helped form the preconceptions of those who followed the explorers and the traders to set up colonial administrations. The basic task of the administrator was to administer, to rule. Thus he sought whatever information he could lay his hands upon that would help him in this task. But in the process, at least during the earlier days, he also might have time to gather up information that wasn't directly related to his official tasks. And it is from this kind of research, the research of people who were first in the field, that the contemporary historian has found a wealth of historical documentation. But the image which such part-time scholars as this usually had clouded the interpretation of the new materials which they gathered. The focus was never again clearly upon African society. The task of contemporary African history has been to shift this focus. The caveat which has been used to identify this shift is African history written from the African point of view. Now this brings up an interesting and a very curious problem. Most writing on Africa to date has come from the pens of non-Africans. Now how can the non-African write from a point of view that is so apparently different from his own? And when he does so write, what sense is it going to make to those people who should form his basic audience, Africans? Well, this obvious solution to this problem will come in the future when there are, in fact, trained African historians writing on African subjects. But there are two factors which have worked to set limits upon such writing as has been done to the present time. First, many of the past generation of African scholars have taken their training abroad. In the process of gaining their training, they have tended to adopt the values and the attitudes which caused them to see Africa from a different perspective, that is, some steps removed from their own traditional historical consciousness. In many cases, they have become superb stylists, yet in an adopted language, again a factor which helps to set them apart from the society which they are describing, their own society. Yet there is one important area where the content of the thoughts of Africans who have studied abroad does retain its firm hold in the African consciousness, and this is politics and political opportunities. This has meant that the majority of Africans trained as social scientists have turned their attention to contemporary events, whether these be events in the colonial period or events of the present state of nation building. Also, sad to say, in the not too distant past, some of those who have received their education either abroad or under a curricular regime which dealt mainly with European history have uncritically accepted the biases found therein. For a significant number of Western-educated Africans, then, the problem has become one of turning the wheel even further around so that they can merge again with their traditional historical consciousness. While the outsider's work is both appreciated and often solicited, the real confrontation, then, of the African with his past awaits some future generation. Still, I would suggest that much has been done and is being done to explore the traditional historical consciousness of Africa and to put it in a written form so that all Africans, as well as the rest of us, can learn from it. I am reminded along this line of a personal experience which I had last year when my wife and I were traveling in West Africa. We were attending a social function in Accra, Ghana, and during the course of the evening, I began speaking with a military officer from the Ghanaian military forces, and he asked me what in the heck I was doing in West Africa, and I told him that I was looking at Arabic documents relating to African history. He said, well, what are you doing in Ghana? I thought all of these documents were up in Timbuktu and Mali and Gao. To which I replied, well, your own university here in Accra has a very large and a very important collection of Arabic documents that relate not only to the north, to the savannah, but relate to the south, the old area of Ashanti and Kumasi. He says, why, Kumasi is my hometown. I said, I didn't know there was anything. Well, yes, of course, there's long been a Muslim community in Kumasi. Well, what do you know about that? And this, I might say, fortunately for us, ended up in an invitation to attend a very fine dinner at his house where we could continue this discussion, which we appreciated very much. But it also points to the kind of exhilaration and excitement which has come through this new application of the study of African history by Africans and by outsiders. Now, what final or even tentative shape this recovered past will take is certainly quite beyond my capacity to say. The answers to such questions as, how complete will it be? That is, will we ever be able to know intimately the personalities of, let's say, 4 generations back? Or will we perhaps uncover important records which will give us clues as to the structure of society in past centuries? The answers to these questions, of course, remain for future study. But what has already been learned leaves room for fairly great hope. The wide-ranging approaches in which scholars from many disciplines have contributed their special knowledge to an examination of African history have given rise to a whole new set of interpretations. The most important of these interpretations has been suggested earlier, that the crusty notion of African societies as static entities has now been overturned. Anthropological insights have led both anthropologists and others, including historians, to reevaluate the sources and the evidence which they already possess. From this reevaluation has come awakening awareness that social change, both internally motivated social change and social change stimulated from the outside, is as much a constant of African history as it is the history of any other society. But there's more than just this, the item of change, and that it has occurred. We are now beginning to understand and to see the kinds of change that occurred, and foremost to the historian, when these changes occurred in time. Secondly, there is a recognition of the traditional African historical consciousness upon which the modern investigator must depend in order to penetrate his topic to begin with. In specific terminology, I refer to both the oral and written traditional histories, that which lies yet to be read by the non-Islamic scholar, and that which needs the telling in order to be collected. The query has shifted from, is this oral tradition quite accurate, to, Let us listen. Let us compare this tradition with other, perhaps written evidence that we possess, and then let us begin the assessment of its accuracy. Beyond that, there are archaeological evidences which go into making up our image. For instance, the painted rocks of the Sahara, the fossil and tool remains of prehistoric man, especially in East Africa, the magnificent terracotta and bronze sculptures of West Africa, plus a whole range of recent discoveries dealing with the nearer times. All of these evidences are now being examined with a focus that attempts to center within the ancient memory of Africa itself. I would like to conclude tonight by making a few remarks which bear directly on the theme of this lecture, using Africa's past to argue for its future. The central question is, how does this new African history have a bearing on modern African society? Of course, the question can be asked about any society, but in this case, I think it's pertinent to ask about history and African society. Firstly, does it assist in problem-solving tasks which new nations must face, new nations that have been recently created, often with boundaries that cut across ethnic divisions? I would suggest that the answer is emphatically no. The use of historical references to solve outstanding disputes or to create, or wishfully thinking, to recreate alliances carries the germ of raising much more serious problems than the one with which the argument began. Such extrapolations from the past can just as easily have an opposite effect, reviving old and forgotten antagonisms. Similarly, the painstakingly slow process of reconstruction in historical narrative is never directly related to policy making, God forbid that it ever should be. At the present stage of African historical studies, much can be regarded as tentatively known, tentatively understood. That such knowledge should be put to the tasks of governing would constitute its grossest misuse. The historical component of ideology is a frequent proof of this assertion. I would suggest that what a knowledge of history does provide at its best is both a milieu and a mood in which Africans can discuss their problems as well as their achievements. History opens up an area of mutually understood and communicated experience, the very references one uses in conversation. Through reference to his past, the African then communicates with the rest of the world on a plane of experience through which all social beings must pass, through religion, through philosophy, art, and drama, as well as the wars and battles, kings and succession disputes, politics, social inequalities, yes, the defeats. Additionally, for school children who will receive training from books that tackle the new African history, there will also be a new tradition of that kind of history that you remember, a shared experience in which one will someday be able to joke about the past as well as speak of it in tones of deadly seriousness, much like the American schoolboy who rebels at memorizing the names of all the American presidents. And if undue emphasis currently seems to be placed by Africans on their own past achievements and greatness, and if this continues for a few years, it seems not unwise to remember that in France there was a Michelet, in America there was a George Bancroft, in every other country there were similar figures. I feel that the African's reward comes through the very recovery of his past, in a form that not only he, but other Africans can comprehend. And quite definitely, of course, his reward is our own, a better understanding of the human community.
Thank you very much, Professor Griffith, for that very revealing discussion of African history and both African and non-African historians and the limitations but yet the possibilities of history for the prediction of the future. We do have some time for some questions, and so I will now ask you if you have any so Professor Griffith can undertake to reply to them.
Yes, ma'am.
result of the artificial and accidental incidents of European colonization in certain areas, does there seem to be any indication that in the future some of these areas which are so artificially sundered, areas, for example, that have a cultural and historical entity which are now in 2 or 3 different national entities. Is there any indication that there will be a regrouping to clarify this?
The question is, are there any historical models, really, for the regrouping of African peoples on the basis of old historical models, since in the colonial era it appears that boundaries were artificially drawn? Well, as I suggested to you earlier, it's a very dangerous project indeed to undertake arguing for a reconstruction of past events. And this would mean a reconstruction of boundaries on the basis of old historical entities. I doubt very seriously that this will ever take place. What may take place is in the realm of a new development, which comes under the general heading of Pan-Africanism or African unity. Now, there have been many attempts in Africa to date, since the late 1950s, to establish federations. Some, like the country of Nigeria, certainly comprising a number of disparate units, seems to be a success to date. Others, which didn't conform to the old colonial boundaries, like the Federation of Mali and Senegal, found the going a bit too rough at the beginning. Although this is not to say that a federation might not take place later. But on the basis of, and of course there are other prospects for federation such as that in East Africa, perhaps even further ones. But to say that this would take place on the basis of historical models, I think not. Yes, sir.
Over in our music department, there's great interest in African music. Is it possible to distinguish historical periods, say in African music, as one can in East Asian music or European, which would illuminate the cultural history of Africa? Can this kind of discipline be used?
I am told that this is so, but it's a topic upon which I have utterly no expertise of my own, and I believe, in fact, there will be one of the future lectures in the series will deal with this topic. As for giving you an answer myself, I'm afraid I can't. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the library in Timbuktu, and from my experience, I know of libraries in northern Mauritania where there are Arabic records, which we can expect to get some knowledge. Can you comment on what work is being done with these records in terms of translating and so on?
The question is, what work is currently being done with Arabic materials found in West Africa, primarily those in Mauritania and portions of what is now Mali? Well, I'm afraid to say that there are 2 problems involved here. One, there is a substantial body of Arabic literature from West Africa, that is literature written by Africans, that has been collected through the years, and some of it taken to European archives. Some of the most important documents. And these have been worked on for, let's say, the past 50 or 60 years, being brought out in translation, being used as a basis for other historical studies. Yet there's another, and perhaps even more significant, body of documentation that has to date completely and totally escaped the notice of Western scholars. And that is the Arabic material that remains still in those places, much used by the Islamic scholarly community. The problem is the rapprochement between these two. I was told, for instance, upon a visit to the Republic of Mali itself, that there are in the neighborhood of 50 to 100,000 documents which are known. That is, the kind of documents the historian uses: letters, diplomatic correspondence, poetry, religious writings, all sorts of things, that are in the possession of their original owners, have never come into a national archive. And until these, in fact, are collected or put on film or made available through some central institution, work cannot go forward. This is the first step. Yes, sir.
major war in which the main issue was border frontier clashes or border disputes?
The question is, are there any examples from pre-colonial African history in which the major issue was frontier clashes, is this correct? Or border disputes? I think this question probably deserves a more complicated answer than I'm going to give it, or than I'm able to give it. And that is, if you conceive of borders in the modern sense, that is, as frontiers with its whole raft of customs officials and police and whatnot, and that transgression over these borders constitutes a violation against which you take action, I think it's misconceiving the nature of territorial groupings in Africa in the pre-colonial period. That in this sense, challenges were perceived on the more fundamental level of who is going to levy tribute over one's neighbors, for instance, or who has the rights to uses of certain kinds of land, pasture land or farmland, which a family or a group or a lineage traditionally has the use of. And that disputes over these, if these could be considered border disputes, then perhaps so. Otherwise, I would say the delimitation of frontiers in the sense which we think about it, with it, their Siegfried lines and whatnot, no.
Therefore, the objections of the attack that you made to larger unities created on a more or less pre-colonial, conception of pre-colonial African unity are invalid.
I don't object to them. I'm saying that to try to create them on the basis of historical argument would probably create more problems than it would solve. I project no solutions.
I was asked a question there, I think I'll pass it on to you right now. I was asked whether you would see any similar reaction that is now happening against Western colonialism. The same kind of reaction happening against Muslim influence, or is it too far back in history to have that impact?
The question is the kind of reaction which is taking place today against the colonial or imperial powers. Was there ever a similar reaction in the past to what might roughly be defined as Islamic imperialism? I should say in some examples yes, in some examples no. It depends upon who the Muslims were. And it depends upon what within the society they challenged. The basic pattern of Islam in pre-colonial African society was that it came not as an aggressor, came not in a military form so much as it came in a peaceful form, that is, by traders, by clerics, and by divines, although there are any number of outstanding examples of the destruction of one power by another in which the one was theoretically Muslim and the other was theoretically not Muslim. So there are these examples, but I think to attempt to correlate them directly with the reaction and resistance to the colonial experience would not be historically valid.
Actually, I meant in a modern historical...
Oh, in modern, at the present day. One writer on Islam in Africa has suggested that this is a sword that cuts two ways. One, that there are elements of conservative, and I'm using the term now, reactionary, that is reaction to the intrusion of a new cultural form. There are elements of this in the association of certain peoples, at least in West Africa, perhaps in other parts, to the introduction of a forced conversion within Islam. But on the other hand, the penetration has been by and large a peaceful one in modern times, and I think with the exception of certain rather militant brotherhoods, you could not categorize a resistance on the same way that you could in the political plane.
To what extent have Arabic sources been of use in writing history in East Africa in comparison to that of West Africa?
To a considerable extent. To a considerable extent. In fact, it has been suggested that in East Africa, numerous documents which still repose in the archives of the countries now of Oman and Kuwait up in the Arabian Gulf do in fact relate to West Africa, and that no one has yet actually systematically attempted to use these sources with respect to West African history. But of documents of a local provenance, considerable use has been made. Unfortunately, their depth in time is not as great as those for West Africa, and it is not as full. because it handles a much smaller area, a coastal strip.
What effect, if any, has there been with the many different non-Arabic languages of Africa on the Pan-African movement?
The question is, what effect has there been of the non-Arabic languages of Africa on the Pan-African movement?
Has this hurt the movement toward unity?
You mean the presence of so many languages? Has this hurt the movement toward unity? I should think not. I should think, in fact, that since the use for matters of daily business and exchange across borders, and actually much exchange within borders, is based upon the use of a second language. It need not necessarily be French or English. It might be Arabic, it might be Hausa, it might be another Swahili, another language of Africa, that it, in fact, had a stimulating rather than a retarding effect. I'm just guessing, but this would be my guess.
How extensive are the present efforts at recording the oral history in Africa?
The question is, how extensive are the present efforts to record the oral history, the unwritten history of Africa? Again, it's a matter of degree, not as much as historians would like to see is currently going on. On the other hand, there's a great deal more going on now than there was even 2 years ago. Within, for instance, Nigeria, an example which I'm more familiar than some others, there are 3 separate projects dealing with oral history, 1 in the western region and 2 in the eastern region, or an area which is now the midwestern region of Nigeria. Also in Ghana there are such projects, and among specific scholars in the former French territories, the now modern Francophone nations of West Africa, there are a few projects. Also in the Belgian Congo, in Rwanda, Burundi, there are similar projects of collecting oral history by scholars, as well as by those trained by the scholars to go out and record in their own villages. So the number of projects is on the increase, and collections are in fact being made within Africa itself. Another important collection being made, other important collections being made in universities here in the United States, including this university. But as I say, this is only a matter of degree, and most people are turning their attention to other subjects. Yes, sir.
Are there any non-Arabic African nations that had a written script?
That had a written script. Now, this is a question about which I cannot answer too carefully. There are forms of writing which may have originally been deduced from the outside, and there may have been languages in Africa which were invented independently. But this is a rather specialized subject upon which I cannot speak, I am afraid. And with the exception of one important language in the Chadic area, it's called Kanuri, it was early influenced by Arabic or by Islamic scholarship that came in. So the distinction between whether there was a pre-existing alphabet or system of writing, again, I can't comment on. Yes, sir.
What is the nature of the documents that you talked about, or the one that you saw in Ghana?
Oh.
Are they dealing with genealogy, history, and such, or are they essays on philosophy or science, or what kind of?
The question is, what are the sorts of documents that I saw when I was in Ghana? And he asked if they were genealogies, as I mentioned, or if they were rather treatises on philosophy, religion, and science. I might say that they were both, very often in poetic form, as a great deal of Arabic writing is. They were family histories, what's called the silsila, the history of the genealogy of given leading families. Many of them were these. Others were treatises on aspects of especially Muslim law and science, but also important documents dealing with historical events. One, an important chronicle of the 18th century, upon which a great deal of work is currently being done. Now, these are just a few of the documents that have been collected to date. Others are known to exist and are in the process of being acquired by institutions there. So we don't know yet to what extent these will be documents that will give up significant historical information. But the supposition is, on what has been collected to date, it might be very great.
Is there
Yes,
any
ma'am.
historical work of this nature being done in South Africa or Angola, any place south of the Sahara?
Oh yes, it's being done in South Africa, all right. About Angola, I can't say. It's a little difficult for non-Portuguese and for African scholars to get into the Portuguese territories. But in South Africa, very certainly. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the beneficial side of history, that what it would have on the present-day Africa, the idea of African people realizing some identity among themselves. To what extent, could you approximate, are present teachers of African history in Africa cognizant of historical consciousness?
The question is, to what extent are teachers in present-day Africa conscious of the historical tradition, the developing historical tradition to which I have been referring? Again, I'm afraid this comes in the nature of a somewhat specialized question that might better be answered by those who have had dealings with the teachers in Africa itself. I do know that in the places where I have visited, there is an increasing enthusiasm on the part of secondary school teachers and certainly on the part of university teachers to reorient the courses of study to an African focus rather than to a European one. But much of this is still in the dreaming stage, I'm afraid, and I would suspect that the body of teaching being done there in the secondary schools today is European history. Yes, sir.
Insofar as the oral traditions are concerned, how are they handling chronology?
Well, it depends upon, the question is, how are they handling chronology in oral tradition? The basic rule of the thumb is no accurate chronology can ever be inferred from an oral tradition unless there are supporting collateral sources. And this would mean written sources, archaeological evidence, and in some cases, internal evidence within the source itself, such as reference to a natural phenomenon or reference to other historical events with which it can be related. But the use of them to derive a strict chronology is indeed quite limited.